time. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I'm really delighted for this portion. This is the keynote presentation by Professor Rochelle Davis. And the title of the talk is Studying Displacement and Statelessness in the World Today. This will be about an hour-long session. And I'd like to first introduce our guest speaker, our keynote speaker. Dr. Rochelle Davis is the Sultanate of Oman Associate Professor of Anthropology in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, part of the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Her main research is on forced migration, war, and conflict, particularly Palestinian, Syrian, and Iraqi refugees and internally displaced persons. Her first book, Palestinian Village Histories, Geographies of the Displaced with Stanford University Press, addresses how Palestinian refugees today write histories of their villages that were destroyed in the 1948 war, and the stories and commemorations of village life that are circulated in the diaspora. She is currently writing a book on the role of culture in the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Professor Davis was the lead qualitative researcher on a project with the International Organization for Migration, a 6-year longitudinal study of 4,000 Iraqi families displaced by ISIS. She has published articles and reports on displaced Syrian, Sudanese, and Somali refugees in Jordan and gender and vulnerability, in particular Syrian men faced with forced conscription into the Syrian army. For more of her publications, you can see those on the Georgetown website. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Rochelle Davis.
Thank you very much, everyone, and I echo all of the other thanks and at the organizers and all of the hard work of the people behind the scenes at making this possible, because the presentations I've heard so far have been really super fantastic, and I look forward to more conversations with you. I'm going to start first by a little bit about myself, that I've been an academic studying forced displacement for more than 20 years now, and an activist around these issues of particularly justice for Palestinians and displaced people for more than half of my life. It's a thrill for me to be here with other long-standing colleagues and some people whose work I've read and really look up to. Professor May Saikali is one of them, who had a huge influence on how I was a graduate student, Professor Asil, Professor Najib, and many others. I know that the issues that we are talking about here today are not just academic for many people in the conference, and I recognize both my privilege as a white female academic who has the security of access to a passport, as well as tenure in a powerful institution in the capital of the United States. My university, Georgetown University, is built on the traditional unceded land of the Nacotchtank and Anacostan Piscataway people, and it's the product of enslaved labor and the sale of enslaved people. From my position and privilege, I'm going to respectfully offer some reflections on the issues and trends I perceive in the study of forced migration and statelessness today. And I really do want to thank the amazing organizers and outstanding panelists of this conference for the opportunity to be here. I've learned so much from everyone's work who's participating in the conference, and I am Zooming in here while I'm on sabbatical in Connecticut. And I'm living on Nahantic and Mohegan ancestral lands. This is the first time in like three months that I've talked to more than 4 people. So I'm a little bit like, woo, this is exciting. And also a little nervous making. I want to describe a decision I made more than 10 years ago about sort of how we portray and study displacement and statelessness. And when the uprising began in Syria in 2011 and the ensuing violent crackdown by the Syrian regime, and then we saw the rise of armed movements, all then morphing into an all-out war, I stayed connected to my colleagues and friends there. And I watched the images of Syria and Syrians coming out in the news. I had lived in Syria in the summers of 2008 and 2009. I'd visited many times before and done some research. And my last visit was in December of 2010. So in 2000 and particularly 13 and 14, when people started fleeing Syria in large numbers, like others watching the news, I saw images in the press of Syrians thankful to have survived water and land crossings to safety. And I understood these images, sorry, you weren't supposed to see that yet. I understood these images in certain ways because I had known Syria and Syrians. And I came to realize that these images were initially seen one way. For example, we can all think back to the global reaction of the photo of the drowned child Aylan Kurdi on the Turkish shore. But these images also allowed the viewers to understand them as they wanted. Good research has been done on how viewers see the person and the problem or crisis they represent, and what the ensuing media narratives are that get tied to those images and those people. What is obvious for all the obvious reasons is that viewers don't see those people's own stories or their own understandings of their experiences of violence and displacement. At best, these media photos allow us to see what has happened to people and to see people as victims. At worst, these photos are hijacked by politicians to keep people in situations of insecurity. And this slide of Nigel Farage is an example of how these images were then put to use in the Brexit vote. So what are we as viewers supposed to do with these when these photos push us for sympathy and empathy with our fellow humans, and yet our political leaders and governments are making it more and more difficult for displaced people and migrants to find safety? We could say the same thing about the images of people on the southern United States border, or the incredible violence against the Rohingya in Myanmar and their forced removal. And the list goes on and on. These photos that were taken to show people's suffering and need, and that then are also being used against them, are all part of publics becoming more emotionally blunted and politicians choosing not to offer safety. So about 10 years ago, I made the conscious decision to stop showing pictures of displaced people from the media in any of my presentations or public teachings. And I tell my audiences that I don't do this and why I don't do this. To me, it became obvious that it was an ethical choice that I had both towards my subject as well as my audience. Syrians and Palestinians led me to this decision because they have produced so much visual commentary on their situation: signs, actions, artwork, videos, cartoons, etc. This image is one of them. So by showing their commentaries on their lives, rather than a journalist's photograph of their situation at a particular moment, I think we can strive to offer audiences not just the emotion of empathy for a victim, but a new understanding for the richness of the lives of people, the choices they have had to make, and their experiences as they represent them. And we can show via their own artistic and other cultural productions about themselves who they are. This one I love, it's beautiful. It takes this, sort of awful picture of destruction in Syria, and this Syrian cartoonist, Joan, does this, he recreates it. He makes, he puts people back into the picture, Ahlen Jar, Ramadan Kareem, Taxi Tala, and it just brings all of it sort of puts life back into the destruction. So as you will see I'm going to use images like this throughout. So what I want to talk about is not that. I seem to have disappeared my outline slide, sorry. I'm going to talk about a variety of structures and things. I think my slide is a little bit further down, but I want to start by really thinking about how we talk about and represent displaced people. So in the UNHCR Global Trends Report of 2020, which comes out the year after, so in 2021, this report counted 82.4 million forcibly displaced persons, the highest ever in UNHCR's 70-year history. This population is made up of refugees, as you can see, and internally displaced persons, who are in the green, who are almost twice the number of refugees. Likewise, it includes Palestinian refugees, and that's what I have circled there in the 5.7 million. And this is really one of the only places that UNHCR ever counts Palestinian refugees. It also includes statelessness in their people of concern to UNHCR, which is the 4.2 million in the yellow that they mark. But in counting people of concern to UNHCR, they remove the Palestinians. 3/4 of the overall total are living in what are labeled situations of protracted displacement, meaning that they have been displaced for more than 5 years. And these statistics show that displacement is not only a pressing issue today, but one that our global political system has failed to address over time. So starting a presentation on displacement in the world today with these UNHCR statistics is almost cliched because it is done so often. But I want to start this way to talk about a couple of things. First, how much we have normalized the system of counting and categorization and why it matters that we unpack some of the categories and narratives around displaced and stateless people in the world today. And to encourage us as scholars of displacement and statelessness to think about ethics and to contextualize our work in ways that don't problematize displaced persons and instead problematize political and military forces that create displacement. How do we do that? The usual framing is that displaced people require humanitarian solutions, and that it is, and those humanitarian solutions are important. I'm not saying that they aren't, but people are stateless and displaced because of political problems or increasingly environmental disasters or economic exploitation. We need to constantly keep the political, whether that is state violence or ethnic cleansing or the rise of armed militias or the failure to manage environmentally induced catastrophes or the economic policies of neoliberal states that fail to care for their citizens. We need to keep those front and center. How can we as scholars or people in a position to amplify the voices of those who are displaced, help keep the context and causes for people's displacement and seeking safety front and center in our work? I want to explore that here today through both research questions and methodological and ethical ways to think about our fields of study. The other reason to start with these statistics is I also want us to think about how state policies and the acts of counting displaced persons and producing numbers and statistics also creates opportunities for us as scholars to do research in certain situations and to have more difficulty or less ability to know about other situations. For example, the situation of Syrians in Turkey and Jordan is particularly well studied and well known, whereas what is happening to Syrians in states in the Persian/Arabian Gulf that do host Syrians, but don't host them within the UNHCR framework, that remains kind of really a product of just governmental, Gulf governmental speculation. So it's always worth asking in our work, who or what does the counting and the representation in numbers, and what systems are created for the work, who gets to be heard and who isn't heard or who isn't seen. So when we think of statistics, we think of things like refugees, IDPs, Palestinian refugees living under the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees mandate. We think of asylum seekers. And we create understandings about these people framed in categories of people and sort of the kind of issues that arise with them, rather than seeing the repressive governments, the wars, and the environmental disasters as causing this huge number of people to be in these situations of insecurity. And there is this, Syrian that comes from, that came out in probably about 2013 of sort of the types of bullets used to kill Syrians every day. And if you look at this, you might think that this is just a picture of the bullets, but instead the real focus is on, you know, used to kill Syrians every day, right? And it really is almost very dark humor about, like, you know, we're dying all the time. Let's make sure we categorize and make sense of, you know, how we're dying, right? So I think we also, and we'll talk about this, is to recognize how the international community has developed systems that can quickly respond to disasters and war and get food and shelter to people in the immediate sort of task of saving lives. However, these systems, as the huge number of protracted displacements show, largely fail to go beyond the emergency aid paradigm. The international community has developed a formula that transitions emergency aid into development aid. But as many examples you'll hear during this conference point out, this does not solve a displacement problem. So listening to the displaced and the host communities around them shows where some of these issues are. And this is an artist collective in South Sudan that is called Ana Taban, and sort of brings these issues up. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of the international refugee regime, implications of the structures of that regime, state power, rights, and rightlessness. And then I'm going to sort of conclude with methodological and ethical issues. How do we amplify displaced and stateless voices, and how do we think about rights in research? And these are some of the questions that I really tried to think about and answer, both in my teaching and in my research. And I try to keep in the forefront of the work that I do. The international system is based on the state citizen model, on this Westphalian model of states and states' rights that Dr. Riyad spoke about earlier. How do we as scholars study refugees and citizens outside their state or stateless people in this model? And what can we do not to reify their status and powerlessness? And then we know that humanitarian solutions do not solve political problems that generate displaced persons. How can we as scholars shift focus in our work to address the political? So the UN system established after World War II codifies ideas about being in the world that are inseparable from this Westphalian nation-state system that produces states and borders and citizens. That's the way our world today is ordered, although that's not the way our world today exists. Our terminology for people on the move reflects this, as I mentioned before, but this system really delimits human movement for those without citizenship or not in their state of citizenship. But it also impacts their rights. And I'm going to come back to this issue of rights later on. And there are several ways that we see the state-centered system playing out in today's politics, in which countries like, for example, China, are very protective of a state's rights within its own borders. And so they will not vote in the UN against for any resolution or against any resolution that proposes that there be intervention inside a state's borders because the state is oppressing its populations. And so, for example, China was always vetoed issues around what was going on in Syria after 2011, among other places. But how we see this playing out also then is that Uyghur citizens of China, Muslim in the eastern part of China, have been determined by the state to not fit how they want the state to, how the state wants its citizens to be. And they are incarcerated, held incommunicado, and deemed sort of need to be in need of re-education. And they sort of shut everything out and will, of course, take no criticism of their behavior. This is a great slide by a Syrian artist, Imran Novi, who, sort of illustrates the role that the state can have in even stopping the United Nations. It's an orange cone put up on the road as, UN aid delivery was to be coming into Syria. Syria said no. And so the UN sort of screeched to a halt. And he illustrated this in this way. I want to talk a little bit about statelessness because that is the topic of the conference today. And I've already mentioned sort of how people are counted who are displaced, but statelessness is, of course, not necessarily a displaced population. And so stateless exist in total limbos today, as many as panelists in our conference will discuss and have discussed. Sometimes stateless people live in states that deny their nationality. Sometimes they live in states where they live in they come from states where the states that have disappeared. And in other cases, they are evicted from where they live to another. When communities are made stateless, we see it as the enactment of border wars on the bodies of people, right? The borders have moved to the land that you're on and you don't belong here, or we are going to remove you from the land that you are on. We've seen this historically in Europe in the 20th century, and we've seen it also throughout the world with the advent of citizenship as a category of governance. So today, the Rohingya, who've been attacked and driven out of Myanmar, number 1 million people, and they have been told they belong elsewhere largely because they are Muslim. The Tibu in Libya, used by the Gaddafi regime to claim territory from Chad, have now had borders redrawn around them, and they are now told that they are Chadian. there are many, many, many more examples of these collectives. So it's not just the ethnic and racial and religious politics of state officials deciding who is in and who is out, but it is also the states using the idea of outsiders to strengthen a particular vision of the inside the nation state. UNHCR statistics tell us that 85% of displaced persons are hosted in the global south. But when we repeat that to global north audiences, what we perhaps inadvertently create as a takeaway is that these are their problems in the global south. And it is incumbent on us as researchers and scholars to show that connections between the global north's fiscal, military, environmental, and political interventions that are part of creating the problems of the global south that create these massive displacements. This is not to ignore the role of global south states and individuals willing to use violence or other methods to displace people or render them stateless. Rather, we as scholars must do the work to tell the whole picture that our research subjects have experienced. And so you can see in this CIPRI data that US arms exports by region have been 46.7% of US arms go to the Middle East. And another 26.9% go to Asia and the Pacific. I mean, this is largely the situation because states in these areas can buy these weapons, but it also we need to always make these connections. The Transnational Institute has done some really interesting work on looking at how European arms exports are forcing millions from their homes. And so they're worth looking up, and so there are sources for this, and people have been doing work on this. Others too have been commenting on it. There's been a lot of push to get people to see that in the global north that we sell weapons. Our countries, our governments, our economic systems that we are part of sell weapons that make people flee, and that there is a push to have, that is our responsibility as well, because we benefit from these systems. And Syrians, of course, are deeply aware of this. This is from Zapiro, a South African cartoonist. But as you see, Putin is there with Russian arms sales, and on his whatever kind of weapon that is, there is a UN veto tied to it, and he says, try this one, it's on the house. It's also important to think about how the global world might host displaced persons differently, and how different states and communities and individuals are tapping into narrative and structures that address them, whether these are UN narratives about refugees, nationalist narratives, and also other supranational ones, such as the African Union or Muslim scriptures, as some of our panelists have discussed. One way that scholars and states are looking today at different models, whether these are embedded in notions of hospitality or of hosting guests, are as notions of hospitality and hosting guests, as Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon have done with various populations, most currently Syrians, although as others have noted, Iraqis in Jordan as well. It's also worth noting how racialized this notion of hosting and guestness is, particularly toward African refugees that are how they are looked at and perceived versus non-Black refugees in the same country. And you see this particularly in Jordan, where Iraqis were seen as our brothers and they were allowed to come in as guests. But whereas Sudanese refugees who are also Arab and who are also Arabic speakers are not seen as our brothers and are not seen as guests, and so the racialized ways in which displaced populations are seen in countries is worth always thinking about and making clear. So some of the other ways that people raise are, for example, the Organization of African Unity described in the pieces from 1992, traditional African hospitality has been the basis of acceptance and assistance to refugees in Africa. However, with pressing economic and social problems, asylum countries tend to be more positively inclined to receive and offer protection to refugees if there is assurance of burden sharing from the international community and an inbuilt package for durable solutions. So anyway, the OAU is really trying to think of how to kind of both tap into traditional hosting relationships, as well as be part of a larger UN system that pushes burden sharing onto the global South, but that can be sort of monetized. That's what burden sharing means, is that people get lots of money, countries get lots of money to keep the refugees in those places. Another one, which others are much more expert on than I am, is trying to also look back and think about how Muslim scriptural texts and histories about hosting and belonging and displacement might feed into some of the ways that host countries or host individuals or communities also are active in bringing in people into their communities. So there's both Quranic verses such as this one, but then there's also early Muslim communities' histories, both the hijrah to Medina, as well as the period of exile in Ethiopia. But we see this Security Council around the drain, another piece by Imran Novi. Before we give up on the 1951 Refugee Convention, I think it's worth a second look to see what it was and where we are now. And so the UN Refugee Convention from 1951 really provides a stark illustration of the huge gap between the codification of refugee rights and host country responsibilities in 1951 and the dismal situation of rightlessness and privation today. And I always ask my students in classes where I teach about displacement to read the convention in order to, and it's really long, it's like 80 pages. It's not that hard to read, but I give them a specific assignment to, so that they can see the gulf between what was envisioned in terms of rights in 1951 after World War II, and then what we have today. And so I just put up a couple of examples of sort of the contracting state shall accord to refugees lawfully staying in their territory the most favorable treatment accorded to nationals of a foreign country in the same circumstances as regards the right to engage in wage earning employment, freedom of movement, rights to access courts. It's article after article of all of these rights that refugees have and responsibilities to obey the laws and those sorts of things. My students are always surprised by how jurisprudence is now basically limited to the right to life and protection from torture and inhuman and degrading treatment. And sometimes the non-refoulement, the being forced to return. And that is, they are always surprised by this, despite all that is in the convention, that it's just been stripped down to these kind of very few things. Really, evidence of where we are today is this situation of protracted displacement. And so in the 1990s, on the average, 1.5 million refugees were able to return home each year. But in the 2000s, sorry, in the 2010s to 2020s, that number has fallen to around 385,000, meaning that growth in displacement is in fact today far outstripping any sort of solutions that we might think about. And the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, says at present in 2020, quote, people cannot be expected to live in a state of upheaval for years on end without a chance of going home, nor a hope of building a future where they are. We need a fundamentally new and more accepting attitude towards all who flee, coupled with a much more determined drive to unlock conflicts that go on for years and that are at the root of such immense suffering. And so this 1951 convention itself is a product of the Cold War, post-World War II era, and really only displaced people who flee oppression fit into its definition. So as we move into a different world, Oxford scholar Alexandra Betts poses new ways for us to think about displacement, including economic and environmental refugees who do not fall under the definition of the 1951 Refugee Convention. And he talks about it in his book called Survival Migration. But he argues that, quote, ensuring the protection of survival migrants does not necessarily need new institution. It simply requires a commitment to make existing institutions work better. And in the context of climate change and the related new drivers of forced migration, survival migration will happen anyway, and dealing with it within a clear institutional framework will offer host and donor states greater guidance, predictability, and international reciprocity, end quote. So I want to come back to my larger questions that I opened with and really think about how we as scholars and those who study people on the move or stateless people make sure not to reify the state and its ability to decide and determine who is deserving of safety in the words we choose and the way we present material, and to make sure not to echo the racialized and anti-Muslim or anti-refugee or anti-migrant or anti-Black or other discriminatory actions that lessen human life, make humans illegal, and limit access to rights. And so one way that some scholars have proposed that we think beyond state structures is to think in terms of a rights-based framing around displacement and statelessness. And Article 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights sort of declares that everyone has the right to a nationality. And as presentations in this conference will discuss, this right is something that states will often find loopholes out of, and they either ignore them or actively remove people's rights to nationalities. And there are plenty of examples that you'll hear about, and I won't go into them. A very painful illustration of this reality of statelessness are these kind of two pieces of artwork by Palestinian artists. Oops, that's not the one I wanted to show you. That was this one. And this is just a travel document. This is what is issued to issued to Palestinians living in Syria. And as you can see, it looks like a passport, but it is really just, it says وثيقة سفر للاجئين الفلسطينيين. And it's also called a laissez-passer. This artist, Ala Hayatleh, has remade these Palestinian travel documents from Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. And he has put on them the signs of toxicity and danger and nuclear of radioactivity in place of the national symbol. And so by this act, he's made he's shown what so many Palestinians have experienced, is that they are a danger, that their statelessness is a danger, and that danger to the nation and danger to others. And so he's really done an amazing, I mean, it's a really provocative and thoughtful artwork. A second piece by Ahmed Al-Arabi, who it must be a pen name, is it takes the poem by Mahmoud Darwish, which says, كل قلوب الناس جنسيتي فليسقطوا عني جواز السفر. So the hearts of my people are my citizenship, so I don't need this passport. And instead, he's taken, the artist has taken this and says, so I don't need this, فليسقطوا عني وثيقة سفر للاجئين الفلسطينيين. So I don't need this travel document for Palestinian refugees. Right? So he's taken this really sort of symbolically important and beautiful piece of poetry by Mahmoud Darwish to say, you know, people are my world, and I don't need a passport. And he's kind of also turned it into this to show that it is that it applies all around. So one way to think about the material about rightlessness is to think about how it plays out in the world of rights and citizenship, and to think about those people who are deemed transient or unprotected by the state of their citizenship, or people who are incarcerated or driven out. And there are so many examples of this that I won't necessarily list them. Not just in sort of the global South or China today, there are also cases where individuals are also deemed not belonging, either because of their political politics, or because they, have said something. So Bahrain has been pushing people out. I think they've removed citizenship from almost 300 different people. And then what happens to children, et cetera. The US has done this as well. And it hit the news when the UK did this with the Windrush Generation, which were some 500,000 UK residents who were born in Commonwealth countries and arrived before 1971. They were given indefinite leave to remain, but the Home Office kept no record of those who were granted leave to remain, and they issued no paperwork. And in 2010, the British Home Office destroyed the landing cards that had belonged to the Windrush migrants. And because they came from British colonies that were not independent, these people had always thought that they were British citizens. And so there was this huge uproar when the British government had deported some and declared the act to deport others because they weren't citizens. But rights may not always be the best way to think about some of these subjects. And I want us to think a little bit about work put out by Naomi Pack, who writes about rightlessness. And her book is called Testimony and Redress in US Prison Camps Since World War II. And she makes the point that rightlessness, one of its defining characteristics is the deprivation of certain kinds of supposed inalienable or constitutional or human rights, like due process, habeas corpus, or the right not to be tortured. And she says, she builds on Hannah Arendt to say that rightlessness is the inability to have the right to have rights. So what she means by that is that there's no political or social community that cares that you don't have those things, right? And that there's no one to appeal to. So she says one of the central ways that I define rightlessness is the inability to make oneself heard. Rightless people speak to their condition all the time, but the problem isn't that they're not speaking the right way. The problem is that we are either unwilling to hear or incapable of hearing what they have to say. She says, quote, "The argument is that rightlessness is produced by rights regimes, that we can't understand what rights are without rightlessness hanging out somewhere in the background. So even if we're not explicitly acknowledging it, is the fact that I have rights and that other people do, the fact that I have rights that are recognized by other people and institutions makes sense only because other people do not." So she, in this book and in a couple of other pieces, really pushes us to think about what rights and rightlessness may be. And then when we think about rights, I'm going to go back, sorry, hang on, I need to. Got my slides mixed up. When we focus on rights, we should always ask ourselves what happens to senses of home and self and family and land, which are not necessarily part of a rights discourse. And a number of papers so far today have really cogently addressed the issues of home and belonging that anchors people to places and empowers and gives meaning to their lives and their contributions to where they live. And I think if we turn to Indigenous scholars and communities, they are particularly attuned as to how having a rights discourse is really between the individual and state, but where does their community fit in? And what about access to and connections to land? I have really kind of thought a lot about this because in this project we did with the International Organization for Migration, where we surveyed over 6 rounds, 4,000 Iraqi households, mostly quantitatively, but I was in charge of the qualitative part of this. So we did a longitudinal study of the same families over these rounds, and it was over 5 years. I wasn't part of it when it was created, but the idea was that we based this on durable solutions, and one of the ways that durable solutions are measured is, so durable solutions are seen today as they're measured by geography. A durable solution is whether people return, whether they resettle, or whether they integrate. And so that's how, when people talk about durable solutions, that's what that means, and it doesn't make sense to anybody who is actually displaced or involved in thinking about it, but it makes sense to the international community that talks about these things. So In the UN's Interagency Standing Committee in 2010, they created this framework on durable solutions for internally displaced persons. And so to think about whether they were accessing durable solutions, they put it in terms of 8 criteria. But these 8 criteria were really about accessing rights without discrimination based on their displacement status. So did they feel safety and security? Did they have an adequate standard of living? Was their livelihood and employment possible? Did they have effective mechanisms to restore land, housing, and property? Were they able to get personal and other documentation? Were they able to reunify with their families? Were they able to participate in public affairs? And did they have effective remedies and justice? So this idea that they were accessing the rights of a citizen without discrimination as to the fact that they had been displaced. So as we sort of went through all of this data and collected it and worked on it, it really became clear that displacement begins when individuals are forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes of habitual residence. In other words, as a result of physical movement. But the IASC framework on durable solution indicates that displacement ends when IDPs no longer have, quote, specific assistance and protection needs that are linked to their displacement, and such persons can enjoy their human rights without discrimination resulting from their displacement. In some, oh, that was end quote, sorry. What we found was that the way that this IASC durable solutions sort of framework looks at it is that displacement begins with geography, but ends with rights. And so there is no kind of geographical way to make sense of how people might experience it. We concluded, and we concluded this because we're academics, not because we work with IOM, because IOM was not going to conclude this, that this analysis shows a limitation of this displacement and resolution nexus that the international community uses all the time. In particular, for those who are displaced, whose sense of whether or not they have found a durable solution may be tied to geography, may be tied to rights, or it may be both. And so in round 6, as you see on the slide in front of you, we questioned all of the people who were still displaced in round 6, saying, do you still consider yourself displaced? 85% said yes. Of those 85%, 57% said that because they have not returned home, and 27% said that it's because they've not returned to their origin or district, their district of origin. And another 13% said because they do not have a house. So almost everybody who said, no, we are still displaced, said so because they had not actually physically returned. It wasn't about rights. Among those who did say they didn't consider them, who said, we're not displaced, I don't feel myself displaced anymore, it was because, as you can see, 64% said they have a network of family and friends. So they had almost recreated communities in displacement. It wasn't, theirs was not even a sense of right, although you have of rights, you do have 18% who have it, say they have a job. And you can see how little this actually ties to feelings of acceptance, because still 85% say they are displaced, but 66% of them said they feel strongly accepted where they are. And so there was no, it wasn't about feeling rejected in their place of, in where they are. I'm gonna come to my conclusion here. So really to kind of start to wrap up, I want to sort of summarize by saying we live in a world in which borders and state-centered system often determine people's ability to access their own abilities to move safely or not, to have rights or not, among other things. And we as scholars in our work should always evidence how the state system is constructed around inclusion and exclusion, as well as rights and rightlessness, and the power of the state to take part in and benefit from the conflicts that displace and make vulnerable other states' citizens as well as their own. And while this happens through wars and arms trades, through global support of repressive regimes, or through inaction, there are many other examples of how this has happened over time in this conference. I do want to say that I say this in awareness of what is happening in and around Ukraine at this very moment, and I think we're all kind of dismayed at at the brokers who think that war and violence is a solution to anything in this very bloody 21st century. And I think it's really important to think of humans in the world today and this very human behavior of having children. How do displaced and stateless people ensure rights for their children? Some states provide documentation, even citizenship, access to children who are born on a geographic soil. So citizens, they may become citizens where they're born. But most states do not. And today, thousands and thousands of children are born without even the right to record their birth, either because their parents are deemed illegal or because their presence is not recognized. And as we think about, I want to kind of come back to thinking about rights, but also tying it to geography and connecting to indigenous ways of thinking about land and people's forced removal from lands. How do states and this rights-based way of thinking disconnect people from lands and lifeways that may be part of their identities and economics, for example? And on the flip side, how are territorial associations of people, when people are tied to a territory, how is that restrictive of their rights to access citizenship or other rights? So I think these two issues of territory and rights need to go hand in hand. By these actions, states and nation states systems fail to protect people. And when people are displaced, they're stateless or they are made rightless, they become vulnerable. As we know, people who are in situations of vulnerability become easy prey for trafficking or recruitment by criminals or militias or at the mercy of corrupt officials. And Shahram Khosravi's work, both his book and his article titled The Illegal Migrant, really illustrates how flight and fear and the desire to be mobile puts people into the hands of those who are able to exploit them and criminalize them, including the state and state actors. So I want to finish talking about research methods and ethics. And I love this, this piece of graffiti from Humps, which says, عندما أرحل تأكدوا إني بذلت كل ما بوسعي لأبقى. So when I finally have left, be assured that I did everything I could to remain here, and to leave it on a physical space, to leave this message on a wall, so that those who remain behind can see, I think is a really kind of a powerful illustration of some of the issues that displaced people face. I opened talking about how we visually represent our subjects to audiences and in our classes, and how that conveys important messages about displaced persons, and how we want to make sure that we are representing them and their concerns. And I want to turn to thinking about how we can make sure we do that methodologically in our research as well. If one of the things that we can do is to advocate for and amplify the voices of those in situations of rightlessness, as Naomi Pak advocates for, then how can we do that in our own scholarship? And I think one way is to make sure that we allow our interlocutors to talk about who they, about what they want, and to listen to how they address the situations they are in, and allow them to speak to power through us. I learned this 25 years ago from the Palestinians that I interviewed when I was doing my dissertation research on Palestinians displaced in 1948. They always interrogated me about US government support for Israel, US hypocrisy towards UN decisions about Palestine, and the demonization of Palestinians in popular American thinking. As I reflected back on what they how they interacted with me, and building on what they really taught me through talking to me, I have chosen in all of my work to always end any interviews with anyone, but particularly with displaced populations, asking them if there are other things they want to tell me, or there are other things they want me to know, or there are other things they want us and what I can do to speak about what they are faced with. I've also included in a variety, in most of my research, I always ask them what they think about the political situation of their displacement and what they'd like to see done about it. And while oftentimes we all may find that this is not necessarily the subject of our research, I think it really helps us respect their perspectives on their own situations and allows the researcher to include those perspectives in their research. Otherwise, there are so many others who are more than willing to speak for them and to speak over them. As I was last month when I was preparing for this talk and thinking about what I wanted to talk about, I came across this tweet by the IOM in Gambia. And it says, from passionately raising awareness on irregular migration, hashtag migrants as messengers, volunteers in the Gambia and around the region are now using their voices to sensitize communities on COVID-19. However, the photo is of, I assume, a Gambian man raising a sign that has nothing to do with COVID-19, but that says no to irregular migration. And so presumably this person has been paid by the IOM because that's how they are working in sub-Saharan Africa today to try and limit irregular migration. To hold up this, to write this sign, hold up this sign, have his picture taken, and then tweet it out on the IOM Gambia as a migrant, as a messenger. And one could argue that the IOM is doing this in an effort to save people's lives so that they aren't risking their lives as they cross the Sahara, as they aren't risking their lives in situations of incredible racism and violence in North Africa, and they aren't risking their lives in as they try and cross the Mediterranean to Europe. But it puts the, but my huge objection to this is it as I've kind of is probably clear, this says that you as an individual can make this choice and that this is all about you not doing irregular migration, as opposed to saying the system that we live in doesn't sort of care for and take care of people and doesn't find ways for people to actually engage in regular migration and people to have legal pathways to get out of situations that they can't survive in or thrive in. And then finally, another way that we can it's an important methodological and ethical issue that we have to always confront is our responsibility as researchers towards the rights of displaced people in research. Those studying displacement, as we are people studying displacement, we also need to do our best not to replicate the rightlessness and vulnerability that people experience by also sort of being subjects of research. And so we really always need to make sure that we let them know their rights as a research subject. Christina Clark-Kazak I think she's at the University of Ottawa in Canada. She's really been pushing for a number of years to think about these kinds of methods. She's got a great edited volume out now called Documenting Displacement. And she has been pushing to bring greater awareness to how research is done and the rights of participants in that research. And so it's really hard to find, but in this, I'll put the link in the Q&A or someplace afterwards, but there are this information sheet for people taking part in forced migration research. She's created a sheet and it's translated in English and French, Arabic, Spanish, Somali, Pashto, Swahili, Farsi, and Dari. I think you can find it through the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration website, but I'll put this link in there and you can see it. So teaching and talking about these issues, whether it is about displacement or research methods, or displacement or research methods, helps us normalize displaced persons as people with rights and who have perspectives on their situations to those who listen and read our work. And I believe our responsibilities of researchers are ones that Edward Said raises in his book Covering Islam from 1981. He says, "We have to begin with the idea that all knowledge is interpretation, and that interpretation must be self-conscious in its methods and its aims if it is to be vigilant and humane, if it is also to arrive at knowledge. But underlying every interpretation of other cultures, especially of Islam, is the choice facing the individual scholar or intellectual, whether to put intellect at the service of power or at the service of criticism, to put intellect at the service of power or at the service of criticism, community, dialogue, and moral sense. This choice must be the first act of interpretation today, and it must result in a decision, not simply a postponement. And I think the panelists in our conference today are really models of how to do this work, this work that Edward Said calls on us to do. It is our obligation to our fellow researchers, to our students, and to our local and global institutions to really think about creating knowledge in the service of criticism, community, dialogue, and moral sense. Thank you very much.